A day in the park. The soft glow of early afternoon sunlight bathed the city park, casting long shadows across the grass and lighting up the faces of children playing nearby. It was a perfect day with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves and laughter filling the air. For Captain Marcus Williams, a well-respected officer known throughout the community, this was a rare day off. For once, he could set aside the weight of his responsibilities and simply enjoy the company of his 11-year-old daughter, Amina. Marcus treasured these moments. Between long shifts, unpredictable hours, and the demands of his job, days like this were few and far between. He cherished the opportunity to let go of the duties and tensions that came with his badge and be present as just Amina's dad. They strolled hand in hand through the park, and Marcus smiled as Amina skipped beside him, her curly hair bouncing with each step. She was full of energy and curiosity, her laughter a constant melody that Marcus never tired of hearing. "Look, Daddy," Amina exclaimed, pointing toward a group of sparrows hopping around a park bench, pecking at scattered crumbs. "They're so small and cute. Do you think they'd let me feed them?" Marcus chuckled, bending down to her level. "Maybe if we sit quietly, they'll come close. Birds are skittish, though, like they know we're giants to them." Amina giggled, taking her dad's hand again, as they moved to a spot on the grass, shaded by a tall oak tree. They stretched out under the tree's canopy, relaxing in the warmth and tranquility around them. Families lounged on blankets nearby, children raced around the playground, and a couple tossed a frisbee back and forth with laughter. For Marcus, this was a slice of paradise. He was just a dad spending time with his daughter, free from the pressures of his position, the late-night calls, and the stress of his responsibilities. Just Marcus and Amina. And today, he had promised her an ice cream treat, a small reward for helping with chores around the house. As they relaxed, Amina's gaze wandered to a colorful ice cream cart across the park. She tugged on her dad's hand, her eyes shining with excitement. "Daddy, can I have an ice cream now?" she asked eagerly, her voice filled with the sweet hopefulness only a child could muster. Marcus pretended to think it over, tapping his chin as if he hadn't already planned to get her one. "Well, let's see. You did do the dishes last night, didn't you?" She nodded eagerly, and he gave her a playful smile. "I guess that earns you a treat. Wait right here, okay?" With a nod, Amina settled back on the grass, watching as her dad made his way toward the ice cream cart. She felt safe and happy, surrounded by the warmth and liveliness of the park. Marcus glanced back at her, smiling at the sight of her waving to him, both of her hands raised high. But as he joined the short line at the cart, he didn't notice the tall, lean figure dressed in a police uniform lingering in the distance. Sergeant John Dawson had been patrolling the area on his day off, keeping a discreet eye on the people around him. With sharp features and an intense gaze, he blended easily with the crowd, his uniform offering him a silent shield of authority. Dawson's eyes scanned the crowd, but when his gaze settled on Amina sitting alone, something shifted in his expression. A strange glint crossed his eyes as he approached her, a carefully crafted smile on his face. From a distance, he looked like just another friendly officer on patrol, but there was a darkness in his gaze, a hidden intent that only those closest would recognize. "Hello there," Dawson greeted, crouching down so he was at eye level with Amina. His voice was warm, calm, and oddly soothing, as if he were trying to build trust. Amina looked up, surprised to see an officer talking to her. She'd grown up around her dad's colleagues and was used to police officers, strong, friendly figures she trusted. And so she smiled politely, a bit shy but open to his conversation. "Hi," she replied, her voice small but friendly. "What's a young lady like you doing all by herself?" Dawson asked, feigning concern as he looked around as if searching for someone. "You know, parks can be a little dangerous, even during the day." Amina felt a faint unease as Dawson's gaze lingered on her, but she brushed it off. He was a police officer, after all, and she trusted the uniform. "I'm just waiting for my dad. He's getting the ice cream," she said proudly, pointing toward the cart where Marcus stood in line. Dawson's smile widened, though there was a sharpness in his eyes that Amina couldn't quite place. "That's nice of him," he replied, his voice smooth. "You must be very special to him." Amina nodded, still not fully comfortable with Dawson's gaze on her. She shifted slightly, hoping he'd move on and leave her to wait for her dad in peace. But instead of leaving, Dawson inched closer, his voice lowering to a quieter tone. "You know, I could help you find him if you'd like," he offered, gesturing toward the crowd where Marcus stood. "Sometimes those lines can take forever." Amina felt her discomfort deepen, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She glanced at the ice cream stand, watching for her dad, but the crowd blocked her view. Turning back, she replied politely, "No, thank you. I'm fine." But Dawson didn't move. His friendly demeanor wavered slightly, and his smile faded just a touch, replaced by a harder expression. "Come on now," he murmured, his tone shifting to something more insistent. "I'm just trying to help." The words sent a shiver down her spine, and Amina felt the first pangs of real fear. She tried to scoot away from him, but he closed the distance, reaching out and gripping her wrist with a firmness that betrayed his earlier gentleness. Amina's eyes widened in alarm. "I'm okay," she stammered, pulling her wrist back as subtly as she could. "My dad's right there." Dawson's grip tightened ever so slightly, his tone lowering to a cold edge. "No need to be afraid, sweetheart. I'm here to make sure you're safe." The words felt wrong, like a twisted imitation of what a police officer should say. Dawson began to guide her toward a nearby bench, his fingers still locked around her wrist. Amina's heart raced, her mind scrambling for what to do. She wanted to scream, to yell for help, but fear paralyzed her. She glanced around, hoping someone would notice, but the people in the park were too absorbed in their own lives to realize what was happening. Just then, Marcus turned around, holding 2 cones in his hands. The sight of the empty spot where he'd left Amina hit him like a jolt of electricity. His heart skipped a beat, and his eyes darted around the park, searching for her familiar bright shirt. Then he saw her, being led toward a bench by a man in uniform. At first, he felt relief, assuming it was just a friendly officer helping her. But then he noticed Amina's frightened expression, the tense way she held her body, and his instincts flared to life. Dropping the ice cream cones, Marcus sprinted across the grass, his heart pounding as he closed the distance between them. "Amina," he called, his voice filled with a mix of relief and anger. Amina's head whipped around at the sound of her father's voice, her eyes lighting up with relief as she tugged against Dawson's grip. Seeing Marcus approach, Dawson released her, his expression slipping into a mask of surprise. "Captain Williams," he greeted smoothly, straightening up. "I was just helping your daughter here find her way back to you." Marcus's eyes were hard as steel as he pulled Amina into his arms, his protective instincts roaring to life. "Stay away from my daughter," he said, his voice low, each word laced with barely restrained fury. Dawson raised his hands in mock innocence, a small smile playing on his lips. "Just doing my job, Captain. Didn't mean to overstep." But Marcus wasn't fooled. He watched as Dawson turned and walked away, his back stiff, his face impassive. He didn't know what Dawson's intentions had been, but he knew one thing for certain. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, and he'd make sure Dawson answered for it. Marcus held Amina close, his heart still pounding with the intensity of his emotions. As they left the park, he made a silent vow to himself. He would protect her at all costs, no matter what. He wouldn't let anyone harm his daughter. Not now, not ever. Realization and the first steps of investigation. Captain Marcus Williams paced his modest living room, phone in hand, the events of the afternoon replaying in his mind. His heart was still racing, his nerves raw. The expression on Dawson's face as he released Amina, the smug confidence, the too calm mask of innocence, haunted him. It was the look of a man who believed he was untouchable. That alone sent chills down Marcus's spine. Amina was in her room now, her favorite stuffed animal tucked under her arm, as she curled up with her sketchpad. She was unusually quiet, her normally bubbly personality dampened by the events of the day. Each time Marcus had asked if she was okay, she nodded, offering a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. The memory of her frightened expression when she saw him across the park filled him with guilt and anger. It was a look he'd never forget, a flash of fear he never wanted to see again. Harris slid a folder across the desk. "I wanted to give you an update on what we've uncovered so far. It's troubling, to say the least." Marcus opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. His stomach twisted as he read through complaints and reports, each one describing behavior that was, at best, unprofessional, and, at worst, predatory. While none of the complaints had resulted in formal reprimands, there was a pattern of uncomfortable behavior with young women and children, a pattern that had somehow flown under the radar until now. "These are records from the past few years," Harris explained, his voice heavy. There were a few minor complaints made against Dawson, mostly dismissed as misunderstandings. The officers handling them concluded they were misinterpretations, but looking at these together, it's clear something was missed. Marcus felt a surge of anger. The fact that these complaints had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, or worse, because no one took them seriously, sickened him. A system that was supposed to protect the vulnerable had failed them, allowing Dawson to continue unchecked. The more he read, the more furious he became. Each ignored complaint felt like a slap in the face, a betrayal of the very values he had sworn to uphold. "We're taking this seriously, Marcus," Harris said, sensing his anger. "He's on leave now, and the investigation is fully underway. But I won't lie to you, there's pressure from above to keep this quiet." "Keep it quiet," Marcus echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. "Captain, this isn't just an internal issue. We're dealing with a man who's used his position to harm others. People need to know." Harris sighed, nodding reluctantly. "I know, and I agree with you, but the department fears public fallout. They're concerned about trust in the police. We have to handle this delicately." Marcus gritted his teeth, his hands clenched into fists. He understood the need to preserve public trust, but what about the trust of those who'd been harmed? What about the children and families who had relied on the police to protect them? "Captain, I can't sit back and watch this be swept under the rug," Marcus said firmly. "If the public doesn't trust us, it's because we failed to hold ourselves accountable. And if Dawson isn't held accountable, we're telling the world that this kind of behavior is acceptable. It's not just about my daughter. It's about everyone he's come into contact with." Harris looked at him, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "You're right, Marcus, and I won't stand in the way of the truth. I'm just letting you know what we're up against. We'll do everything by the book, and if it comes to it, we'll make sure the truth sees the light of day." Marcus nodded, grateful for Harris's support. "Thank you, Captain." As he left Harris's office, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. This was about more than just his daughter's safety. It was about setting a precedent, about fighting for accountability within the force. He knew that by speaking out, he was putting his own reputation on the line, risking the respect of some of his colleagues, and even his own peace of mind. But as he thought of Amina, of the look of fear on her face in the park, he knew he couldn't do anything else. Protecting his daughter and others like her was worth every sacrifice. Marcus Williams had spent years as an officer dedicated to upholding the law and protecting the vulnerable. Now he realized his greatest act of service might be challenging the very system he'd given his life to protect. The next morning, he stood outside Amina's room, watching her as she slept, her face peaceful and untroubled. He felt a pang of guilt for the fear she had faced because of Dawson's actions, but he also felt a fierce pride in her bravery. She had trusted him enough to tell him the truth, and he owed it to her to make sure her trust wasn't misplaced. As dawn broke, filling the room with soft light, Marcus made a silent vow to his daughter, to himself, and to the people he served. He would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. Unable to ignore the gnawing dread in his gut, Marcus picked up his phone, scrolling to his supervisor's number. Captain Harris, his mentor and superior, was a serious man with a long-standing commitment to upholding the integrity of the force. He was strict but fair, and he valued honesty above all. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for Harris's mentorship over the years and knew that if anyone could handle this delicate situation with integrity, it would be him. As he dialed, Marcus felt the weight of the situation press down on him. This wasn't just about reporting suspicious behavior. It was about confronting the possibility of betrayal by a fellow officer, someone he'd worked alongside, trusted, but he couldn't let that stop him. The safety of his daughter, and any other vulnerable people Dawson might encounter, was too important to ignore. After a few rings, Harris's gravelly voice came through on the line. "Captain Williams, what can I do for you?" Harris's tone was calm, as always, but Marcus detected a note of concern. "Captain, I need to report an incident involving Sergeant John Dawson," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with restrained tension. "Something happened today at the park. It involved my daughter, Amina." There was a pause. "I'm listening." Taking a deep breath, Marcus recounted the events of the afternoon, carefully detailing everything he had seen and the disturbing behavior Amina had described. He left out no detail, even describing the unsettling look Dawson had given him. He could feel Harris's silence on the other end of the line, the weight of his words settling heavily. When Marcus finished, Harris finally spoke, his voice grim. "This is serious, Marcus. Very serious. If Dawson acted as you described, we have a problem on our hands, one that requires immediate attention." "I know, Captain," Marcus replied, relief mixing with his anxiety. "I need to know Amina and others will be safe. I can't let this slide." Dawson's behavior wasn't normal. It felt predatory. "We'll take immediate steps to handle this," Harris assured him. "I'll begin with an internal review and see if there's anything in Dawson's record that could support your concerns. But Marcus, you understand this will be complicated. We'll have to tread carefully." Marcus clenched his jaw. He knew all too well how complicated this would be. Investigations involving one's own colleagues were fraught with obstacles, and he had no illusions about the difficulties they'd face. But as he looked over to Amina's room, where the door was slightly ajar, he was more certain than ever that he had to pursue this. "I understand, Captain," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes. I just need to know Dawson won't be near my daughter or anyone else in the community. I can't let this slide." "We'll proceed with a formal investigation," Harris replied. "For now, I'll see to it that Dawson is put on administrative leave pending the outcome. I'll need your full cooperation, Marcus. There may be backlash from others in the force. You know how these things can be." "I'm prepared for that," Marcus replied. Though a small pang of worry flared in his chest, he knew that exposing a fellow officer could make him a target within his own department, but he had made peace with that. His duty as a father came before anything else. After a few more logistical details, Marcus ended the call. He sat on the edge of the couch, feeling the weight of what he had just set in motion. The fear and anger that had driven him to act slowly gave way to a determined calm. He had done the right thing, and there was no turning back. Over the next few days, the investigation began quietly. The department didn't release any details to the public, but within the precinct, whispers spread quickly. As Marcus walked through the halls, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some looked away, while others offered nods of support. The precinct was divided. Some believed Marcus had done the right thing, while others felt uncomfortable, a silent resentment brewing among those who valued loyalty over transparency. By the third day, he could feel the pressure mounting. A few of his fellow officers had avoided him, while others shot him sidelong glances, muttering among themselves. It didn't bother him. He'd expected it, but it reminded him of the deep-seated culture of loyalty that often complicated matters of integrity within the force. That afternoon, Marcus was called into Harris's office for an update. As he entered, Harris looked up from a stack of documents, his expression solemn. "Marcus, thank you for coming in. Take a seat." He gestured to the chair across from him. Marcus sat, his heart pounding in anticipation of what Harris might say. The department's reaction and new revelations. The following week felt like a gauntlet of tension, whispers, and stony glances. Every morning, Captain Marcus Williams entered the precinct with his chin up, his shoulders squared, determined to stay focused. But the weight of the situation pressed down on him with every step, like an invisible hand tightening around his chest. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some supportive, others suspicious. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew that challenging one of their own would put him under scrutiny. As he passed by groups of officers gathered in low conversations, he caught snippets of words. Betrayal. Integrity. What's he trying to prove? Some looked away as he approached, while others offered curt nods, a silent acknowledgement of the stand he was taking. But a few officers looked openly hostile, as though they were daring him to justify his actions. He understood why. Exposing Dawson's behavior wasn't just about Dawson. It was about breaking a long-standing code of silence. By the third day, tension between him and a few of his colleagues had turned into open resentment. Marcus knew that some saw him as a turncoat, a man willing to throw a fellow officer under the bus. But this wasn't just any officer. Dawson had targeted his daughter, had manipulated his badge to betray the trust of an innocent child. And Marcus wasn't about to let that slide, no matter the cost. That morning, Marcus was preparing for a briefing when Lieutenant Sarah Miller approached him. She was a trusted colleague, a level-headed officer with a reputation for honesty and dedication to her work. Sarah placed a firm hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "Marcus, mind if we talk for a minute?" she asked, motioning toward an empty hallway. He nodded, grateful for the distraction. They stepped into the hallway, and Sarah turned to face him, concern etched in her face. "How are you holding up?" Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck. "I've been better, Sarah. The whispers, the looks. It's not exactly easy, but I can't let it get to me. This is too important." Sarah nodded, crossing her arms. "I want you to know I'm with you on this. I've heard things about Dawson over the years, minor complaints that got dismissed, but nothing like what you've described. I'm glad you're pushing for an investigation. We can't let behavior like his slide." Marcus felt a wave of relief. Having Sarah's support was a welcome reprieve from the isolation he had been feeling. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that more than you know." She offered a small smile. "I'm not the only one who feels that way, you know. A lot of us believe in what you're doing, even if they're too afraid to say it out loud. It's not easy to go against the grain in this line of work." Marcus nodded, knowing she was right. Loyalty was a double-edged sword in their field, creating a culture that valued unity but also demanded silence in the face of misconduct. He was starting to realize just how deep that silence ran. As Sarah walked away, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. If there were others who shared his views, then maybe he wasn't fighting this battle alone. But even with Sarah's words of encouragement, he knew the toughest days were still ahead. Later that afternoon, Marcus was called into Captain Harris's office for an update on the investigation. As he stepped inside, he found Harris seated at his desk, his face drawn with the strain of the past few days. A thick folder lay open in front of him, filled with pages of complaints, interview transcripts, and notes. "Marcus, thank you for coming in," Harris began, gesturing for him to sit. "I wanted to bring you up to speed on where we are with Dawson's case." Marcus took a seat, his eyes fixed on the folder. He could feel the tension in the room, a heavy silence that spoke to the gravity of the situation. Harris took a deep breath. "We've reviewed several complaints filed against Dawson over the years, most of which were dismissed as misunderstandings or minor misconduct." But after cross-referencing these with more recent incidents, a troubling pattern has emerged. He handed Marcus a document from the folder. It was a list of complaints, each one detailing encounters with Dawson that had left civilians uncomfortable or frightened. There were accounts of Dawson overstepping boundaries during routine stops, making inappropriate remarks, and even using intimidation tactics on those who were vulnerable or alone. "This isn't a man who made a one-time mistake," Harris continued, his tone somber. "He's displayed a pattern of behavior that suggests a willingness to abuse his authority for personal reasons. I've seen enough here to warrant further action. We've placed him on indefinite leave pending a more in-depth investigation." Marcus's jaw tightened as he read through the list. Each complaint was like a small piece of a larger puzzle, painting a picture of a man who had operated unchecked for far too long. The more he read, the more his anger simmered beneath the surface. "Captain," Marcus began, looking up, "we can't let this end with administrative leave. Dawson has a history of targeting people, especially vulnerable young women and children. He's a threat, and it's only a matter of time before he crosses another line. We need to go public with this." Harris held up a hand, his expression conflicted. "I agree, Marcus, but the department is concerned about the public reaction. They're worried about the backlash, about the impact on trust in the police force. They're urging us to handle this quietly." Marcus clenched his fists, struggling to keep his voice steady. "And what about the trust of the people Dawson's hurt? What about the families who trusted us to protect them, who believed we would hold each other accountable?" Harris sighed, nodding slowly. "I know. Believe me, I understand where you're coming from. But the department's hands are tied. They're prioritizing damage control." A surge of frustration washed over Marcus. Damage control. That was the priority, not the safety of the people they served. He felt a pang of betrayal, a reminder of the cost of challenging the status quo. But he couldn't let this deter him. He was determined to push forward, no matter how difficult the road became. "I can't accept that," Marcus said, his voice firm. "This isn't about covering for a mistake. This is about protecting people, about doing what's right. If the department won't stand behind this investigation, I'll find other ways to make sure the truth comes out." Harris looked at him, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Marcus, I respect your determination. You're doing what's right, even when it's difficult. But be careful. Not everyone here shares your commitment to transparency, and there are those who won't take kindly to this investigation. You're going to face resistance from within." "I'm prepared for that," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I didn't come into this lightly, Captain. I'm willing to accept whatever comes my way, as long as it means Dawson is held accountable." Harris nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I expected nothing less from you, Marcus." As he left Harris's office, Marcus felt a renewed sense of resolve. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was prepared to face them. His duty as a father, as an officer, and as a protector of his community left him no other choice. But even as he resolved to see this through, the impact of his decision began to take its toll. The whispers grew louder, the glances sharper, and the division within the precinct became more pronounced. Officers he had once considered friends now treated him with cold detachment, their expressions unreadable. He could feel the weight of their judgment, their silent disapproval. One evening, as he left the precinct, he was approached by Officer Tomlin, a seasoned officer known for his loyalty to his colleagues and his rigid adherence to tradition. Tomlin stopped him near the exit, his expression hard. "Williams," he said, his voice low, "I've heard what you're doing. Pushing for this investigation, putting Dawson in the spotlight. Don't you think you're taking this too far?" Marcus met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm doing what's right, Tomlin. Dawson crossed a line, and I can't ignore that. This isn't about loyalty. It's about accountability." Tomlin shook his head, a look of disappointment flashing in his eyes. "Loyalty is what keeps us together, Marcus. You're tearing this department apart by going after one of our own." Some things should be handled internally, without turning it into a spectacle. Marcus felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice calm. Loyalty doesn't mean covering for someone who's hurt people. It means holding each other to the standards we swore to uphold. Dawson abused his power, and he's a danger to the community. I can't let that go. Tomlin's jaw tightened, his gaze hard. Just remember, not everyone here sees it that way. You're on your own with this, Marcus, and when the dust settles, don't expect us to come running back to you. With that, Tomlin turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the dim hallway. He felt a pang of regret, but he pushed it aside. He had known from the start that this would be an uphill battle, one that would cost him friends and allies. But the stakes were too high to back down now. As he drove home that night, his mind drifted to Amina. She had been quieter than usual since the incident, her usual lightheartedness replaced by a somber silence. She hadn't spoken about Dawson since that day in the park, but Marcus could see the lingering fear in her eyes. He knew that her sense of security had been shaken, and it broke his heart to see her struggling. When he arrived home, Amina was waiting for him in the living room, her sketchpad on her lap. She looked up as he entered, offering him a small smile. "Hi, Daddy," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" She hesitated, looking down at her sketchpad. "Better, I think. But is that officer going to come back?" Marcus's heart clenched as he squeezed her hand. "No, sweetheart. He won't come near you again. I promise." Amina nodded, her gaze uncertain. "I trust you, Daddy. I know you'll keep me safe." As he hugged her, Marcus felt a surge of renewed determination. He was doing this for her, for every child and every family that deserved to feel safe in their community. No matter the cost, he would see this through. A difficult decision. The days passed with an uneasy rhythm, each one bringing more tension than the last. Marcus could feel the walls closing in around him as he fought to keep the investigation moving forward. With every step, he was reminded of just how deeply the code of silence ran in his precinct. Unspoken loyalties and old alliances made each day a minefield, and Marcus was beginning to understand that his decision to stand up against Dawson had turned him into an outsider. By the end of the week, things had taken a darker turn. What had once been subtle whispers and cold glances had transformed into direct confrontations. Officer Tomlin, along with a small group of Dawson's close associates, was leading the charge against Marcus, openly questioning his motives and suggesting that he was letting personal biases cloud his judgment. In the break room one morning, Marcus overheard two officers talking just loud enough for him to hear. "Can you believe this?" One of them muttered to his partner, casting a pointed look in Marcus's direction. "William's throwing a brother under the bus like this. I thought he was one of us." His partner snorted. "Guess loyalty doesn't mean much to some people. You'd think he'd try to work this out privately, instead of putting on a show." Marcus stiffened but kept his face impassive. The comment stung, but he knew he couldn't afford to let them shake his resolve. There was too much at stake. Amina's safety, the community's trust, and his own integrity. He forced himself to walk away, leaving the break room with his head held high. That afternoon, however, the tension reached a breaking point. Captain Harris called Marcus into his office, his face unreadable as he motioned for Marcus to sit. There was a tightness in Harris's jaw that Marcus hadn't seen before, a look of concern mixed with something deeper. "Marcus," Harris began, leaning forward, "we need to talk about the direction this investigation is taking. The department is receiving pressure, from within and from above. They want us to conclude this matter swiftly and discreetly." Marcus's stomach twisted. "Captain, we're only scratching the surface. There are more complaints coming to light. If we wrap this up now, we're turning a blind eye to years of misconduct. Dawson didn't just overstep. He targeted vulnerable people, including my daughter. We can't ignore that." Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, Marcus, Believe me, I understand the gravity of what Dawson has done. But the higher-ups are worried about the reputation of the department. They believe that dragging this out will only hurt us in the long run. They've asked me to recommend closing the investigation as quietly as possible, with Dawson taking an early retirement. Retirement. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. After everything we've uncovered, you're telling me they want to let him walk away with a pension and no consequences. Harris looked down, clearly uncomfortable. I don't agree with it, Marcus, but my hands are tied. They're framing this as a matter of protecting the department's integrity, saying it's better to handle it internally than risk a media circus. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists, a wave of frustration and anger surging through him. He had sacrificed so much already: his friendships, his reputation, and even his peace of mind. And now they were telling him to let Dawson go quietly, as if his actions had been nothing more than a lapse in judgment. Captain, this isn't about integrity. It's about accountability, Marcus replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. Dawson used his badge to harm innocent people. We owe it to them to see this through, to make sure he doesn't get away with it. Harris looked at him, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. I know how much this means to you, Marcus, and if it were up to me, we'd follow through. But there are political pressures here that you and I don't control. The department wants this done. If you push back too hard, you're risking everything. Your career, your reputation. You have a choice to make. Marcus felt a weight settle on his chest, a crushing realization of the position he was in. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who did what was right even when it was difficult. But now, he was faced with an impossible decision. Keep fighting for justice and risk losing everything, or back down and let Dawson walk away without facing the consequences. After a long pause, he finally spoke. I understand, Captain, but I need time to think about this. Harris nodded, his expression resigned. Take the weekend, Marcus. Think it over. But remember, you're not just making this decision for yourself. You're making it for everyone around you. As he left Harris's office, Marcus felt a sense of isolation settle over him, deeper than anything he had felt before. For the first time, he questioned whether he had the strength to see this through. The thought of losing his career, of being ostracized from the only community he had known, was daunting. But then he thought of Amina, of the fear in her eyes that day in the park, and he knew he couldn't let this go. The weekend passed in a blur of restless thoughts and sleepless nights. Marcus found himself torn between his duty to his family, his commitment to justice, and the fear of what he might lose if he continued to push back against the department. He spent hours pacing his living room, replaying conversations, weighing his options. By Sunday evening, he felt no closer to a decision. In desperation, he decided to take a walk through his neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would help clear his mind. As he wandered the quiet streets, he found himself near Amina's school. The sight of the playground, empty and still, brought a pang of sadness. In that moment, a thought struck him. Amina's trust in him was unwavering. She believed that he would always protect her, that he would stand up for what was right. How could he let her down now, when she needed him most? He knew then what he had to do. The next morning, Marcus returned to the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose. He went directly to Harris's office, determination hardening his resolve. Captain, he said, his voice firm, I've made my decision. I'm going to keep pushing this investigation, even if it means going outside the department. I can't let Dawson walk away without facing the consequences. People need to know the truth. Harris looked at him, a mixture of admiration and sadness in his eyes. I figured as much, Marcus. I knew you wouldn't back down. I can't, Marcus replied, his voice resolute. If we let this slide, we're telling the world that this behavior is acceptable, that we prioritize reputation over justice. I didn't sign up for that. Harris nodded, sighing deeply. Then you have my support, Marcus. But you need to be prepared for the backlash. If this goes public, the department will likely turn against you. You may lose more than just your job. I'm ready for that, Marcus said, a sense of peace settling over him. He knew the risks, but he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he chose silence. Over the next week, Marcus began taking steps to ensure that the investigation would continue, even if it meant going outside the precinct. He reached out to several journalists, carefully choosing those who had a reputation for integrity and commitment to truth. He provided them with enough information to spark their interest, leaving out only the most sensitive details. As the days passed, the pressure on Marcus intensified. Rumors spread, and he was met with open hostility from a growing number of his colleagues. Officers he had once trusted now avoided him, their eyes cold and unyielding. But there were still those who stood by him. Sarah Miller, who quietly gathered evidence on his behalf, and a few others who shared his commitment to transparency. Then, one afternoon, he received a call from one of the journalists he had contacted. The article was set to publish, and it would include details of Dawson's misconduct, as well as the department's attempts to suppress the investigation. It was a risk, a move that would likely end his career. But it was also the only way to ensure that Dawson faced the consequences of his actions. The next morning, the article hit the front page of the city's largest newspaper. The headline read, "Shield of Silence. Police Officers' Abuse of Power Exposed." The article detailed Dawson's misconduct, including testimonies from several victims who had come forward, emboldened by the ongoing investigation. It also included a statement from Marcus, who had chosen to go on record despite the potential fallout. Within hours, the precinct was in an uproar. Marcus's phone rang constantly, his inbox flooded with messages from reporters, community leaders, and even fellow officers. The story had ignited a firestorm, sparking outrage and demands for accountability from the public. Parents gathered outside the precinct, holding signs and chanting for justice, their voices a powerful reminder of why Marcus had chosen to fight. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him as he walked through the halls, their expressions a mix of anger, resentment, and, in some cases, respect. He knew he had made enemies, that he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, but he also knew he had done what was right. As he passed by Sarah's desk, she offered him a small nod, a silent show of support. "You did the right thing, Marcus," she said quietly. "No matter what happens, you can hold your head high." Marcus nodded, a sense of peace washing over him. He had made his choice, and he was prepared to face the consequences. For Amina, for the victims who had suffered in silence, and for every family that deserved to feel safe in their community, he had stood up for justice. And as he left the precinct that day, he knew he had nothing to regret. Community support and legal action. The morning after the article broke, the precinct was shrouded in an unspoken tension, like the calm before a storm. Marcus arrived early, bracing himself for the inevitable fallout. He knew that his decision to go public would stir emotions on both sides, but nothing could have prepared him for the reactions he encountered. As he walked through the precinct, the usual bustling atmosphere had shifted. Colleagues turned their heads away when he passed, whispers buzzing behind him like a swarm of bees. Every glance, every hushed conversation reminded him of the weight of his decision. The article had put the department in the spotlight, exposing not just Dawson's misconduct, but also the system's failure to hold him accountable. Steeling himself, Marcus made his way to his desk, barely acknowledging the glares of Dawson's allies. He noticed Officer Tomlin standing nearby, his gaze cold and unyielding, arms crossed as if silently condemning him. Marcus felt the judgment in the air, a palpable disdain radiating from those who valued loyalty to the badge over accountability. Just as he settled in, Captain Harris emerged from his office, his face a mask of exhaustion and frustration. He motioned for Marcus to follow him, and Marcus felt a surge of apprehension as he walked into the captain's office, shutting the door behind him. "Marcus," Harris began, his voice tense but measured, "you've stirred up quite a mess." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I know, Captain. But it had to be done. We couldn't keep ignoring what Dawson did. Harris sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. I understand your motives, but you've put the department in a difficult position. The media storm, the public outrage, it's more than the higher-ups anticipated. They're calling for immediate action, and they're not happy about your decision to involve the press. Marcus clenched his fists, his voice firm. Captain, we tried handling it quietly. And look where that got us. Dawson hurt people, and he would have continued if we hadn't exposed him. If the department's integrity can't withstand the truth, then maybe it's time for some changes. Harris looked at him with a mixture of respect and resignation. I can't disagree with you, Marcus. But the reality is, the department is reeling from this. They're likely going to conduct a full internal review, and you'll be under scrutiny. I need you to be prepared for that. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of his actions settle on his shoulders. He had known from the start that this fight would come at a cost, and he was ready to face the consequences. As he left Harris's office, he could hear the faint chants from outside the precinct. Curious, he made his way to the entrance, where he was greeted by an unexpected sight. A crowd had gathered outside, holding signs and banners, their voices raised in unison. Justice for victims, they chanted, their voices powerful and unwavering. Hold Dawson accountable. Protect our community. Marcus felt a surge of emotion as he looked at the crowd. Families, parents, young people, all standing in solidarity, demanding justice. It was a reminder of why he had chosen to stand up, to face the difficult truths that others preferred to ignore. Among the crowd, he spotted familiar faces. Neighbors, colleagues from his church, even parents from Amina's school. One of the protesters, a woman with a young daughter by her side, caught his eye and offered him a nod of encouragement. She raised her sign higher. The words, "Thank you, Captain Williams," written in bold letters. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat, a mixture of gratitude and responsibility weighing on him. These were the people he had sworn to protect, and their support strengthened his resolve. As he stood at the entrance, absorbing the sight of the crowd, a reporter approached him, microphone in hand. Captain Williams, could we have a statement? Marcus hesitated, aware of the precarious position he was in, but then nodded, stepping forward. Thank you for being here, he began, his voice steady. This is not an easy time for our department, but it's necessary. We have a responsibility to protect our community and to hold ourselves accountable. I want to assure you that justice will be served. This is not about one officer. It's about ensuring that the people we serve can trust us to do the right thing. The reporter pressed on. Captain, are you concerned about backlash within the department for speaking out? Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe that upholding the integrity of our badge means holding each other accountable, even when it's difficult. Loyalty is important, but so is honesty. I took an oath to protect and serve, and I stand by that commitment. His words seemed to resonate with the crowd, and a murmur of approval rippled through them. The woman with the sign gave him a thumbs up, and Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was no longer standing alone. The following week, the public outcry grew louder, the stories spreading like wildfire across social media and news outlets. Marcus's face became a symbol of courage, a man willing to take a stand against the system he was part of. Community groups rallied around him, organizing protests and calling for a deeper investigation, not only into Dawson, but also into the precinct's handling of past complaints. As the momentum built, Marcus received an unexpected invitation from the city's mayor, Mayor Jacqueline Porter, a progressive leader known for her commitment to transparency. Marcus had met her only a few times before, but he respected her integrity and her willingness to challenge the status quo. When he arrived at City Hall for their meeting, he was led into a spacious office overlooking the city. Mayor Porter stood by the window, her arms crossed as she looked out at the bustling streets below. She turned as he entered, offering him a warm but serious smile. Captain Williams, she greeted him, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me, Mayor Porter," Marcus replied, shaking her hand. She gestured for him to sit, taking a seat across from him. "I wanted to personally thank you for your courage in speaking out. What you've done takes immense strength, and I believe it's a step toward a more accountable and transparent police force." Marcus nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "I appreciate that, Mayor. It hasn't been easy, but I knew it was the right thing to do." Mayor Porter leaned forward, her expression serious. "I've been following this case closely, and I want you to know that you have my full support. The city needs leaders like you. People willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular. I've spoken with the district attorney, and we're prepared to pursue legal action against Dawson. But we'll need your cooperation." "Absolutely," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "Whatever you need, I'm here to help." She nodded, her gaze steady. "We're also considering implementing new protocols to address complaints within the department, to ensure that cases like Dawson's don't slip through the cracks again. Your case has sparked a necessary conversation about reform, and I'd like your input on how we can improve accountability." Marcus felt a surge of hope. This was more than he had dared to imagine. A chance not only to hold Dawson accountable, but to create lasting change within the department. "I'd be honored to help, Mayor. There are a lot of dedicated officers who believe in transparency, and I know we can make a difference together." Mayor Porter smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Thank you, Captain Williams. Together, we'll work to restore the community's trust in our police force." As he left City Hall that day, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, he felt that the sacrifices he had made, the friendships lost, the scorn endured, had been worth it. He was no longer fighting alone. He was part of something bigger, a movement that sought to transform a system long plagued by secrecy and silence. Over the following days, legal proceedings against Dawson began, and the investigation expanded to include a review of all complaints handled by the precinct over the past decade. The process was grueling, but Marcus remained steadfast, providing evidence and offering testimonies that revealed the depth of Dawson's misconduct. His decision to go public had given others the courage to come forward, and more victims shared their stories, emboldened by his example. Meanwhile, within the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted. The backlash was still present, but Marcus noticed subtle changes. Officers who had once been silent were now more vocal about the need for reform, openly supporting his efforts. Even Officer Tomlin, though still distant, seemed less hostile, offering Marcus a grudging nod of respect as he passed. As the case continued, Marcus's role as a whistleblower became a beacon of hope for many. Parents, community leaders, and activists rallied around him, using his story as a call for accountability and reform. The mayor's office worked alongside the police department to implement new protocols for handling complaints, ensuring that allegations of misconduct would be thoroughly investigated and that officers like Dawson could no longer operate unchecked. One evening, as Marcus returned home after a long day of the precinct, he found Amina waiting for him in the living room, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Daddy," she said softly, "are you a hero?" Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at his daughter. He knelt down, taking her hands in his voice gentle. "Sweetheart, I'm just trying to do what's right. Sometimes, standing up for the truth is the hardest thing to do. But it's worth it, especially when it means protecting people." Amina hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "I'm proud of you, Daddy. You're the best dad in the whole world." As he held her, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace. He had fought for justice, faced adversity, and made difficult sacrifices. But in that moment, with his daughter's arms around him, he knew that every struggle, every sleepless night, had been worth it. The road ahead was still long, but he was no longer walking it alone. With the support of his community, the leadership of Mayor Porter, and the unwavering love of his daughter, Marcus was ready to face whatever came next. Justice and healing. The day of the trial dawned cold and overcast, a stark contrast to the intense emotions that swirled around the courthouse. For Captain Marcus Williams, it marked the culmination of a months-long battle, one that had taken a toll on him personally, professionally, and emotionally. As he stood outside the courthouse with Amina by his side, he felt a complex mix of anticipation, relief, and lingering fear. This was the day that would decide whether his stand had made a lasting difference, whether Dawson would finally face justice. Amina squeezed his hand, her small fingers warm in his grasp. She looked up at him with a quiet strength that surprised him. Over the months, she had become his anchor, a reminder of the love and innocence he was fighting to protect. Her bravery and resilience had given him the courage to press on, even when it seemed like the world was against him. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice filled with the seriousness of someone beyond her years. "Do you think he'll go to jail?" Marcus looked down at her, his heart aching at the burden she had carried because of Dawson's actions. He knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "I hope so, sweetheart. We've done everything we can to make sure he's held accountable. Now it's up to the court." She nodded, seemingly reassured. Marcus could see that she understood more than she let on, that the events of the past few months had shaped her in ways he wished he could undo. But he was also proud of her resilience, of the quiet courage she had shown in the face of fear. As they entered the courthouse, Marcus was met with the now familiar sight of community members and supporters who had gathered to witness the trial. Parents held signs of support, activists chanted for justice, and reporters scrambled to capture every moment. The story had struck a nerve, not just within their city but across the state. People were watching, waiting to see if the system would deliver the justice it had promised. Inside the courtroom, Marcus took his seat, his gaze steady as he looked across the room at Dawson. The former officer sat at the defense table, his face expressionless, eyes downcast. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he took in the sight of the man who had once held his daughter's wrist, a man who had abused the power entrusted to him. Dawson's demeanor was different now. Gone was the arrogance, the confidence that had once shielded him. He was subdued, almost hollow, as if he knew his actions had finally caught up with him. As the proceedings began, the prosecutor presented a thorough case, detailing the pattern of misconduct that had defined Dawson's career. Witness after witness took the stand, their testimonies painting a damning picture of a man who had exploited his badge to manipulate and intimidate. Some of the witnesses were victims, their voices steady but filled with emotion as they recounted their experiences. They spoke of the fear and helplessness they had felt, of the trust they had once had in the police, only to have it shattered. Amina's testimony was brief but powerful. Guided by a gentle counselor, she recounted the events of that day in the park, her voice soft but clear. Marcus's heart clenched as he watched her on the stand, his little girl forced to confront a memory she should never have had to carry. When she finished, she looked over at him, and he gave her a reassuring nod, pride and sorrow mingling in his gaze. As the trial progressed, Dawson's defense team attempted to downplay his actions, framing them as misunderstandings or lapses in judgment. But Marcus could see that their arguments were weak, that the truth of Dawson's behavior was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies compelling. The weight of his actions, accumulated over years, painted a picture that could not be ignored. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and endangerment. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, his shoulders sagging as the tension he had carried for so long finally released. Justice had been served, and Dawson would face the consequences of his actions. The sense of closure was palpable, a weight lifted from his heart. As he left the courthouse with Amina, they were met with cheers from the crowd, their voices a powerful chorus of support. Reporters clamored for statements, but Marcus waved them off, his focus solely on his daughter. He knew that the real victory was not in the headlines or the public's approval, but in the knowledge that he had kept his promise to protect her. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of reforms and changes within the precinct. Under the leadership of Mayor Porter and with the district attorney's backing, the police department underwent a comprehensive review, implementing new protocols for handling complaints and establishing an independent oversight committee. The changes were met with resistance from some officers, but Marcus could see the positive impact it was having. The department was evolving, becoming a place where accountability and transparency were valued over blind loyalty. Marcus's role in these reforms became instrumental. He was asked to serve on the oversight committee, his experience and integrity making him a natural choice. At first, he hesitated, aware of the challenges that lay ahead. But he accepted, knowing that his involvement would help create a safer, more accountable environment. Over time, he found allies within the department, officers who shared his vision of a police force that served with integrity and compassion. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Miller, who had been a steadfast supporter from the beginning. Together, they worked to implement training programs that emphasized ethical conduct, empathy, and community engagement. They introduced mandatory workshops on handling complaints and addressing misconduct, creating a foundation for a healthier culture within the department. Through it all, Marcus maintained a careful balance between his work and his commitment to Amina. He knew that his family had paid a price for his stand, and he was determined to restore a sense of normalcy to their lives. He made a conscious effort to spend more time with her, to rebuild the bond that had been tested by the events of the past year. One afternoon, several months after the trial, Marcus took Amina to the park where it had all begun. The same green lawn stretched out before them, the sound of children's laughter filling the air. But this time, there was no shadow hanging over them, no lingering fear. Amina ran ahead, her laughter bright and carefree, her curls bouncing as she raced toward the playground. As Marcus watched her, he felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with moments of doubt and sacrifice. But standing there, watching his daughter's joyful face, he knew that every step had been worth it. "Daddy," Amina called, waving for him to join her on the swings. He smiled, making his way over, and took the swing beside her, his heart full as they swung back and forth in the golden afternoon light. "Do you remember that day in the park?" she asked quietly, glancing over at him. Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I do, sweetheart. But you know what? That day doesn't define us. What matters is that we're here now together, and that we made it through." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "I'm glad you did what you did, Daddy. I'm proud of you." He felt a lump rise in his throat, a mix of pride and love swelling within him. "Thank you, Amina. I'm proud of you too. You're braver than you know." As they sat there, swinging in unison, Marcus felt a sense of closure settle over him. The scars from the past year would remain, but they had healed into something stronger, an unbreakable bond of love, trust, and resilience. In the months that followed, the changes within the department continued, spreading beyond the precinct to neighboring cities and inspiring a wave of reforms across the state. Marcus's story became a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, even when it meant standing alone. And though Marcus had once been just a father trying to protect his daughter, he had become something more, a leader, a voice for justice, and a symbol of courage for a community that had been shaken but was now stronger than ever. In time, the whispers of doubt and resentment faded, replaced by respect and admiration. Marcus's colleagues, even those who had once questioned his motives, began to understand the depth of his conviction. He had reminded them of the true purpose of their badge, to serve and protect with honor and integrity. And as for Amina, she grew up with the knowledge that her father was a hero, not because of his rank or his title, but because of his unwavering commitment to truth and justice. She carried his legacy with her, a quiet confidence and a strength that would guide her for the rest of her life. In the end, Marcus had not only kept his promise to his daughter, but had also paved the way for a future where others would never have to face the same fear and betrayal. He had built something lasting, something meaningful, a legacy of justice, resilience, and love that would endure long after he was gone. And as the sun set on another day, casting a warm glow over the city he had sworn to protect, Marcus knew that he had made a difference. He had fought the good fight, and he had won.